Hello and welcome back to some more The Great Dark Beyond reveals. Today we have the warrior cards, but first we actually have a bit of housekeeping to do. I mentioned on the last reveals that there was going to be a patch, and it's actually a pretty big deal because a lot of the cards that were being linked onto the nerfs especially are cards that seem play in the top decks, which means that this patch is nerfing the top end of the tier 1 decks that are existing in Hearthstone and creates a power vacuum where maybe some of these new decks can actually put their foot through the door and, let themselves through. And boy, do I think Warrior can put their foot through the door with one of their archetypes. We'll get to that in a moment though. The nerfs have been revealed. Here are the cards that have been nerfed. A lot of them have been reverts, so Tsunami, Razzle Dazzle, and Treasure Distributor just got purely reverted back to what they were before. You've got a mana added onto it. The Wondrous One, by the way, was way bigger a nerf than I thought it was going to be. It still draws 3 cards, but it only reduces them by 3 now. It doesn't set them to 0. I thought it was going to set them to 1 instead. But no, big change to the Wondrous Wand. Dorian has got a mana added to him as well, so has Party Fiend, but got 1 attack in the process. Probably the biggest one on here, in my opinion. I think Crescendo's pretty bad as well. They got 1 mana added to it as well. Injured Hauler from Overheal Priest, which has been sitting around the tier 1 deck for quite some time, got absolutely gutted. Its Overheal effect used to be deal 2 damage to all enemy minions. It's now 1. It halved the effect of the Injured Hauler, which I think basically kills that deck as a archetype entirely, because this was such a key card in that deck. So there's definitely some space now for decks to slot in there. Just for a bit of completion, Golden Kobold even got the effect I thought it was going to do. It changes your hand with legendary minions, and they cost 1 less as well. Fine. Alright, let's get to the warrior cards now though, and let's see what we are going to get from this class. We have the Crystalline Great Mace, 2 mana 2/2 weapon. After your hero attacks, give all Draenei in your hand +2 attack. Alright, this is cut from a very similar cloth to Painter's Virtue, a very strong weapon in hand buff Paladin. This was a 4 mana 2/3 weapon which had lifesteal. After your hero attacks, you give minions in your hand +1/+1. So rather than getting the +1/+1, you're actually getting the 2 stats stacked in the attack form, which by the way is really good if you want to be an aggressive deck. And spoilers, I think this is going to be a pretty goddamn aggressive deck when you have built with it. So that's not a big downside. It is a pretty big downside though that it's not every minion. It is only Draenei for Crystalline Great Mace, so you have to build a Draenei deck. You can't pick and choose cards from here and there to make it work. You're also losing 1 swing, and you're losing lifesteal, but all in all though, you lose 2 mana cost on the card, which is a pretty reasonable deal in my opinion. We have also seen that there is some support for this tempo hand buff Draenei deck. We've seen Crimson Commander that has Battlecry and Death Rattle to give all Draenei in your hand +1/+1. And Starlight Wanderer, which gives the next Draenei you play +2/+1. And I can definitely see both these 2 cards and the Crystalline Great Mace going into this tempo Draenei hand buffing deck. Also worth noting, Warrior does have a hand buff archetype, which hasn't really ever paid off yet. They have this in the form of Char and Cup of Muscle. Now, I will say that one of the things that is very unique, I suppose, about Hand Buff Paladin is it basically runs no spells. And actually, the best versions of the deck, in my opinion, don't run any spells. There's a couple of them that run 1 spell here and there. And there's obviously a reason for that. If you're buffing all the minions in your hand, you want to get as many buffs as possible on the cards that you're playing that say buff all your cards in your hand. In which case, the best way to do this is to not put spells in your hand because they can't be buffed. Perhaps the Draenei deck for the Warrior is going to be slightly different. Maybe it's going to be slightly taller than it is wider. And perhaps you can fit some room in for Char and Cup of Muscle. Maybe as well with his name has just completely escaped me as I got into it. With the Spell Burst mechanic as well, maybe you are rewarded for running Cup of Muscle just to enable the Spell Burst of... What is his name? The neutral minion that gives +3/+3 to a minion in hand and the Spell Burst. That guy. Maybe you run that in this deck and you have some sort of spell burst mechanic in it as well. Not sure just yet, but it is something you could consider. Anyway, do we have more Draenei support? Yes, boy do we have more support. We have Unyielding Vindicator, 4 mana 5/4 Draenei. Battlecry, the next Draenei you play also gives your hero its attack for that turn. Wow. Okay, we're ramping up the aggression here. You play your 4 mana 5/4, which is obviously not a great tempo play. On your next turn, whatever the minion you play, and obviously you're going to try and play something that's pretty big, hence the hand buff type thing, you're going to give your hero that amount of attack. That is really scary. It's effectively giving the next minion you play charge. That's a pretty big deal, you know, in Hearthstone. As I said, charge has classically been this keyword now that they've tried to, like, steer away from. And if they ever give something charge, it has, like, a big restriction on it. Including, for example, Mana Thirst 11, when you know, typically in a game of Hearthstone, you can only go up to 10 mana. This, admittedly not charge minion, but it's kind of like the same effect of having charge on your minion. You're just getting the attack that you would have done with your minion onto your face. And in some regards, that's actually not a bad deal for other reasons, because you sometimes could get, you know, scuppered by charge minions with taunt. Minion with taunt in the way? Disgusting, I want to hit their face. Normally in that situation, and being like this tempo-y aggro minion-based deck, which I think this Droid Knight deck will be, you want to save your minions on the board. In which case, you can use your face to clear this pesky taunt minion. You take the damage, who cares? You're not in it for the long run. Health is only a resource. And then the next turn, you can swing through these minions again next turn. I think this is a pretty solid card. Obviously, as well, works really nice with the Crystalline Great Mace. You swing 2 times, you buff all the Draenei in your hand, you play your Unyielding Vindicator, and the next Draenei you play gets +4 attack, aka your hero gets +4 attack. That is really scary. That's like scarily disgusting tempo. Also, if you're doing this, maybe this is the use for punch card. Maybe this is why this card was printed in the mini set. You give your hero another 3 attack, assuming the next Draenei you play has, like, you know, 5 or more attack, which is a pretty reasonable assumption. You're doing 8 damage cleave, and that's going to get you through some pretty big walls. And considering there's going to be a lot of starships out there potentially, assuming, you know, the starships work, this might be a really good way just to chunk through these big statted taunt minions. By the way, just as another comparison, if you just played another Unyielding Vindicator the turn after you played Unyielding Vindicator, you're getting the effect of Soul Shard Lapidary without breaking a Soul Fragment in your deck. And Soul Shard Lapidary in this Soul Fragment deck was a pretty strong card, pretty aggressive. Yeah, I really like this Unyielding Vindicator. A very, very solid card. Oh, by the way, Soul Shard Lapidary was 5 mana, not 4 mana, so it's actually a stronger version of that card. And again, just to, you know, give you a measure to peg these stats to, if you can play a minion with 8 attack next turn, and assuming, you know, you're hand buffing, you're using the buffing with the weapons, if you play an 8 attack minion, you're getting the effect of Inner Demon for free, effectively, because you would have played the minion instead. You are really paying for it in the form of that you had to play a 4 mana 5/4, which in standard is pretty bad. It is static though aggressively. It's not the absolute worst thing to play. It's not crazy bad stat line for, you know, 4 in standard. You could definitely more than make up for that tempo down with the turn afterwards. Now, of all the cards we've seen so far, Velen is the biggest thing you can play after this. You play your 7 mana 7/7, you gain 7 attack. Velen also gets the effect of the Unyielding Vindicator. You play another card the turn afterwards, a Draenei, and you get that attack again. That is pretty disgusting. Just like series of attack after attack after attack. And that's probably going to be backbreaking for a lot of decks. Also worth mentioning, the next strongest one right now is Ace Wayfinder, which obviously, that's a little bit weaker now. You really want to get more attack for your book than just playing Ace Wayfinder or Unyielding Vindicators on top of one another. Perhaps the great developers of Hearthstone might grace us with another strong Draenei. Alright, how about this one, which I think is verging on the strongest minion ever printed that wasn't a legendary. And I'm going to try and back up this bold claim in a moment. It's Stalwart Avenger, 4 mana 7/2 Draenei. Immune while attacking. At the end of each turn, swap this minion's attack and health. Oh my god, this card is disgusting. Like, sincerely disgusting cards. Obviously, this is the thing you want to play after you've played your Unyielding Vindicator to give your hero +7 attack. Very good, very nice. So why am I getting a little bit, like, honestly starstruck at this card? Well, we have seen this effect of swapping minions' attack and health before in the past. Around the Witchwood, we had cards like Pumpkin Peasant and Swift Messenger, and they swapped the attack and health in the hand. As soon as you put it onto the board, though, it was locked in place. This Yu-Gi-Oh! Ass card goes into attack mode on your turn. You play it as a 7-2. At the end of your turn, when it goes to your opponent's turn, it turns into a 2-7. It goes into defense mode, which means your opponent is going to really struggle to deal with a 2-7 even on 4. Also, bear in mind, this is the archetype right now that has hand buff. So this isn't going to be a 7-2. It's going to be something like a 11-3, there or thereabouts. Maybe even a 12-3 at this point. Which means this Yu-Gi-Oh-esque looking card is going to be in attack mode with 11 or 12 attack. Then it's going to flip into a 3-12. Your opponent is going to really, really struggle to deal with that. It's going to be horrible. They're going to have to grind resources into this because they can't let it just flip back again onto your turn, because then it's attacking for 12 damage. It's honestly kind of like the Tar Slime type mechanic where they have really low attack on your turn, but when it's the opponent's turn, they have really high attack, which means they're awful to trade into, and you have to trade into them because they have Taunt. It's the same type of deal with this Avenger, but like on steroids. Sure, it doesn't have Taunt, but you have to attack this thing. It has too much attack. You cannot leave this thing on the board. As I said, if you're buffing this with hand buff, Draenei support, it's going to come back onto your turn on turn 5 when you can attack, and it's going to hit for an awful lot of damage. So I think this is the chef kiss on this Draenei deck. Before I even see any of the other cards, and by the way, there are some other cards, this would have made it work for me. I just see this tempo, Draenei, play a weapon in there, get all the buffs going into the cards in your hand. You're probably not going to run the spells, in my opinion, but we'll see when the full set comes out. Because you might want to put Magatha in the deck for a refill, because the big weakness of these hand buff decks is draw. Magatha, great draw, but you don't really want spells in your deck with that. Anyway, you'll fit something together to do with drawing cards to get this. You play this on 4 after you've buffed it a few times, and it's going to be a real bollock to remove this card. Like, horrible card. Oh, and by the way, what about if you also made it attack immediately? Expedition Sergeant, 3 mana, 3/4 Draenei. Battlecry, the next Draenei you play immediately attacks a random enemy. Wow, okay, well here's the package, right? Crystalline Great Mace, you buff your Draenei in your hand. Crimson Commander, you buff them some more. You play your Expedition Sergeant, and then you play a Stalwart Avenger. By the way, immune while attacking, so this thing could hit you in the face, which by the way on turn 4 means it's doing, at the minimum, 7 damage to the face, assuming it hits the face, which is like Fireball Plus with a 9 stat line attached to it. Disgusting. But it might also trade it into a minion, and it would stay up, and then it would flip. Like, this combo is, to quote Muffy from Arthur the Aardvark, it's vomitrocious. Like, this is seriously scary, like, minion tempo play. You know what, the community, they wanted some board-based Hearthstone. You've got it, it's this deck. This is board-based Hearthstone in 2024. Oh, and by the way, that's not the final piece of the puzzle. We also have the legendary Exarch Akama, 5 mana 3/6 Draenei. After this attacks, all other friendly minions can attack again, except Exarch Akama. What is this card? This is so unbelievable. So not only are you playing this minion-based tempo-ish deck, where you're always buffing the Draenei in your hand, you're always getting more and more value as the Draenei as you play them through the game. Assuming you have a board by turn 5, Exarch Akama is going to make you really frightened. Because if this thing goes into the board, survives another turn, and attacks, you are basically dead. This is going to kill you on turn 6. Assuming you have the board state, you have Akama, bad things are going to happen. Just as again, to peg this card to something, Hulking Overfiend, and we have seen other cards like this, where it says after you've killed something, you can attack again. You don't normally see the text, something can attack again, unless you're killing something on your opponent's board, or you're doing something to your opponent's board state, because then it locks you into not being able to smoke your opponent's face many times in a row. Exarch Akama doesn't have that. Your minions just get another attack again. By the way, I assume that this doesn't overwrite Summoning Sickness, so it would have to be minions that stay on the board from the previous turn that would get this extra attack. But if you can meet these requirements, you could definitely push out with, you know, the 9/3s and all of that, some serious damage. Obviously, you might be pointing out this to me right now. The big weakness of this card is you need to wait a turn for it to not have Summoning Sickness. Or do you? Because there are some Draenei cards that let you attack. How about you play your Expedition Sergeant into your Exarch Akama? Your Exarch Akama attacks, that means that every minion on the board can then get another attack. Very spooky, right? And also that can be set up on turn 8. So assuming you have like a board by 8, you can use this as the finisher, your Expedition Sergeant into Exarch Akama. All the minions you had on the board can attack again. And assuming you've got this great 13-3, something like that, stat line minion, that's going to push out 26 damage. That's a lot of damage. Like, it's a potentially really scary outcome. There's also Stranded Spaceman, the neutral card that gives +2 health and rush. Very good with Exarch Akama, for example. So I definitely see Spaceman going to that deck. The only downside actually of the Spaceman is that it gives you health and not attack. But stats are still stats, right? Especially if you're swapping them. Also, if you're really lucky, Ace Wayfinder, if you play this into Exarch Akama, it might roll Rush Wind Fury. That will break the game. Like, if you, and maybe you will run Ace Wayfinder in this deck for this high roll. If you hit Wind Fury on Akama, it's just GG, right? You have, let's say you have, I mean, if you just have 5 attack minion on the board from the previous turn, and you Wind Fury rush your Akama by some means, your minion would get to attack 3 times in that turn. That's 15 damage. That's a lot of damage around turn 5, so yeah, I think this is going to be a seriously scary finisher, and I think it's going to be like playing against Paladin in the past. You just can't let them have a board. You have to just keep killing the board, because you're always afraid of the Crusader's aura. You're always going to be afraid of Akama coming onto the board and just smoking you for a lot of damage. Oh, and by the way, there are other ways, not just Draenei ways of doing this. Through Felon Flames. That just gives a minion rush and is available to warriors. If you're doing this spell burst variant, then this card is probably going to make the list of that deck. It's a 0-cost spell, very good for spell burst cards, gives Akama rush for 5 mana, so you could actually legitimately do this on turn 5 and push a lot of damage. As I said, the real, like, the winning card is if you can play Stalwart Avenger, you play Akama the turn afterwards, and then you through Felon Flames the Akama. And let's say the Stalwart Avenger took a little bit of damage, it maybe has 5 attack instead. You're still pushing 10 damage with this. And you're still getting more and more buffs on your minions as well as you go through the course of the game. Like, you're just ramping up, and ramping up. Like, seriously scary deck. I will also mention, you potentially could do some really disgusting things with Outfit Tailor. Like, you could double dip on the Outfit Tailor effect. However, the downside of Outfit Tailor, obviously in the Draenei deck, is all the Draenei cards have, like, Draenei tags in them. So it's pretty hard to buff the Outfit Tailor, other than using the pre-existing spells in Warrior for hand buffs. So maybe if the Spell Burst deck is a thing, and there's not actually enough Draenei support for the full Draenei package, maybe you try and put Outfit Tailor in just to try and hit some of the buffs on it, in which case you could Outfit Tailor a Draenei on the board, play Akama, attack with the Akama, and your Outfit Tailor's stat line is effectively being doubled because you get to attack twice with that minion. Conceivable. Alright, now we're going to get to some random warrior cards. We have Spore Empress Moldara, the 6-mana 6/6 legendary minion for warrior. Start of the game, shuffle 7 replicating spores into your deck. A replicating spore is a 5-mana spell. Summon a random 5-cost minion. Your future replicating spores summon it as well. Alright, first big key thing about this card, it isn't cast when drawn. When you draw the replicating spore, you have to spend the mana to play the card. Now, you can wait, you don't have to play it on the turn you draw it, but you have to spend the mana, which is a pretty big deal, as I'm now going to start to show you, because throughout the history of Hearthstone, we've had a few cards that shuffle stuff into your deck, and something happens. Ysera Unleashed is like one of the classic ones of these, very strong card from, I think it was like Descent of Dragons, right? That puts 7 Dream Portals into your deck. When they were drawn, you got a random dragon. That was very good, because they instantly cast the spell when they were drawn, and you'd get a random dragon. How would I evaluate a random dragon? Well, I'd certainly evaluate at that time a random dragon being better than the random 5-cost now, so I think all in all, Ysera Unleashed is just better than Spore Empress Moldara. That's not a bad thing for Spore Empress Moldara necessarily, because Ysera was a very strong card. And you will say there is an advantage of Spore Empress Mildara. It's a starter game effect. Ysera, you always have to play the card, which was sort of a weakness. But 9 mana, 4/12 stat line, not the absolute end of the world. It was still a pretty annoying thing to remove from the board. And if you play this late into the game, you're more likely to draw more portals, in which case you would get a big board full of dragons at the end of the game. So it's a pretty good finishing card. It was so good, in fact, that I think people have tried to brand it to duplicate the effect of Ysera. Very, very strong card. Now, we get to Standard. Marin exists. Now, Marin has just been recently nerfed, but Marin put 3 treasures into your deck. The big thing about Marin, though, which, you know, these extra treasures won't cast when drawn, one of them goes into your hand immediately, so you always get this treasure instantly. Now, would I say a treasure is better than a random 5-cost minion for 5? Yes. Marin's treasures, I think, almost all of them are better than the replicating Spore, so... Do I think Spore Empress Mildara is better than the other shuffle of Marin? No. And then this gets us to Sky Mother Aviana, which I think is where we're starting to draw like some sort of comparison. Aviana shuffles 10 random legendary minions into your deck. They all cost 1. Now, Aviana, you have to play the minion first to get the random legendary minions. Would I say a random legendary minion is close to like a random 5 cost? It's starting to get into that ballpark, but they cost 1, not 5. And you get more cards, which means that if you were playing some sort of value-y control deck, you have more, like, range of your deck before you start milling. Yeah, I think the Spore Empress Mildara, generally speaking, is pretty hot trash. Let's get to the card, though, in general. Let me, like, you know, drive more nails into this card's coffin. The average stat line you're going to get for a 5-cost minion in Hearthstone right now is 4.125. That's not very good for 5 mana on a spell. Obviously, this is because a lot of cards in Hearthstone have battle cries, and normally when they have battle cries, they have weakened stats because of it. If you're summoning a random 5-cost minion, you're getting just the flat stat line, 4.15, with no battle cry on it. That is not very good. That is like a 4-mana card effect stat line, and not even that. Would a 4-mana 4/5 see play in Standard with no effect? No. So actually, it's probably close to like a 3-mana effect. So you're taking a huge tempo loss on playing a replicating Spore. Now, obviously the deal of this is that you play multiple replicating Spores. Actually, just before I get to this, there are cards currently existing in Hearthstone that like cheat out minions of higher costs than the cost of the spell themselves, like Travel Security, Corpse Farm, even a Razzle Dazzler, which I think is the closest thing to like this replicating Spore type card. A lot of them don't see play. Now, Razzle Dazzler did start to see a little bit of play, and this is funnily enough on the 5-cost department, which is going to, like, again, be a really good card to peg the replicating Spores too. Razzle Dazzle didn't see play at 7. There's literally no play. And it only started to see play at 6 because it hit this nice window where you didn't need to get a full board of minions. Getting like 3 5-cost minions on 6 was backbreaking enough for a lot of decks that they just couldn't deal with that stat cost. Replicating Spore to get the equivalent effect of Razzle Dazzle, because bear in mind Razzle Dazzle came with a 4/4 already, you have to play 3 of these. Can you afford the tempo loss of playing it on 1 turn, then the 2nd turn, and then the 3rd turn? I will say at the second play of one of these cards, you are getting 8/10 of stat lines for 5, which I think is good enough to see play, funnily enough. But there are some real low rolls in there. You could hit 1/4s, for example, in the 5-mana minion range department, so it's not guaranteed. It's just so random associated with it. Like, I just don't see this working. The card I think actually though this could be considered to be closest to is something like Dr. Holiday. It's not really like the stat line that matters on the replicating Spore. It's the fact that you're generating a lot of stat lines multiple different times. When you're playing like Dr. Holiday and Shaman, you're not really worried about the 1/1, the 2/2, and the 3/3 frog. You start to worry though about like the 5, 6, 7, and so on frogs. And you have to deal with it on each and every single turn afterwards. So maybe this is where replicating Spore sees some play. You put it in a control deck, and you just keep saying to your opponent, listen, I'm going to keep playing these Spores, and you're going to have to keep answering the Spores. And you'll eventually get to the point where maybe this card will break your opponent's back. So I definitely think this is going to be a control-based card. Now, the downside of this is, do I think Control Warrior will run Spore Empress Mildara? Probably not. Probably not. I think there are just better options. The Odin deck just wants to OTK them eventually. The Highlander deck may be considered running this, but the Highlander deck really just wants to get to the double Battlecry cards, and you take a big tempo hit in doing that already, so I don't think they really want to take too or 3 turns of big tempo losses to play the replicating spores. Also worth noting, the Spore Empress Moldara is still in your deck. So I was saying, like, at the very least, you don't have to play the Spore Empress to get the spells from it. You do have this dead card in your deck. You have a 6-mana 6/7 that at some point you might have to play, and that's a pretty big tempo loss in Standard. So all in all, I just don't really see it. But if you do see it, you could Tide Pool the Spores as well to give you 1 extra copy of the Spores. And it's a pretty nice way to fuel up something like Bumbling Bellhop, a minion I actually thought was going to see a little bit more play than it has been doing. If you have a 5 or more spell in hand, Bumbling Bellhop is 3 mana 6/6 taunted stat lines. On paper, really good, but there's just not enough decks running around right now with 5 or more spells in the deck. And funnily enough, Bumbling Bellhop didn't make the list of Big Spell Mage, so maybe Big Spell Warrior is going to be a thing or something like that. By the way, the final thing, like, you know, if I haven't, like, nailed this thing enough, I just don't see why you'd run Moldara and not kill Jaiden. If you're playing a control deck, and the weakness of the control deck eventually is that you run out of value in the matchup versus another control deck, kill Jaiden is just the answer. You don't need to run all these spores. You'll break your opponent's back eventually with the demons. So I just don't see it. I think if you're a control warrior and you want some sort of tech card to give you some extra value, you'll put Kal Jaiden in your deck and not Spore Empress Moldara. Alright, more random cards. Dwarf Planet, 10 mana warrior spell. Fill your board with random 2-cost minions that attack random enemies. Okay, I'm actually struggling to evaluate this card. I think it's really bad. And I'm going to try and, like, explain why, but it's a bit hand-wavy this time. So, okay, what is a board full of 2-cost minions likely to be? I haven't run the numbers on this because I had stuff to do today. I assume the average stat line of a 2-cost minion is somewhere around like 2.2, 2.4. So it's going to be somewhere between, you're going to hit 2 2s or 2 3s, there or thereabouts. So my gut feeling is you're going to get about, I'm going to say 16, 17 or 16, 18 stats on your Dwarf Planet. Which, by the way, is 10 mana, deals 16 damage, spread across, you know, the board and the face, which is pretty strong. The Scourge getting random undead. Do I think you get more stats than the Dwarf Planet on average? Yeah, I think you would get more stats on average. I think the average undead is more stat line than a random 2-cost minion. So for 1 mana less, you can do that. Now, you will be pointing out, yes, it doesn't push the damage forwards with it. That is true. Alright, move along the line. We have Huddle Up. Fill your board with random Naga. I think we worked out that the random Naga works out to be like 3/4s or something, so it's only slightly better than 2-cost, it's more like a 3-cost. It is 3 mana cheaper though this time, but again, you don't get the extra damage with it, so perhaps that's what's really going to make Dwarf Planet hum, right? It's the attacking aspect of the card. Similarly to, in like terms of stats, we have Carnival Clown as well, which gave you a guaranteed 28 taunt stat line. Obviously, you had to jump through a big hoop for Carnival Clown. You had to corrupt it, which meant you had to spend a 10 mana card at some point during the course of a game, which was pretty expensive. But if you could do that, the Carnival Clown was normally pretty backbreaking for your opponent. Obviously, though, way more stats, and you don't get the damage. But I do think Carnival Clown is better than the Dwarf Planet, if you can get the effect off. Alright, here's where I'm going to try and start to break the Dwarf Planet down a little bit. Scale of Onyxia was a card that was seeing some play in Big Druid fairly recent, like a year and a half ago. And it was a pretty key catch-up card in that deck, because you typically in that deck try to ramp with Guff to very high mana crystals, so that you could play multiple big cards per turn. And the weakness of that deck was that you would have a really weak opening. The big catch-up card was this Scale of Onyxia. This filled your boards with 2/1 minions with Rush. I think 2/1 minions with Rush isn't a million miles away from random 2-cost minions. It's fairly close, or at least in terms of the damage you're getting, it's effectively the same. Sure, some situations with the 2-drops you're going to hit like better static minions. Sometimes you're going to hit Doomguard though, just going to point that out. Random 2-cost minions, Doomguard is still in the pool, so look forward to hitting a Doomguard with doing 10 mana, deal whatever it's going to work out to be, and after that, like 13 damage, and then clear your own board. And I guess and your opponent's board, but I imagine that's going to be a pretty sad time. But anyway, getting back to Scale of Onyxia, this basically guaranteed you to push 14 damage, split into 2s, and it couldn't go to the face. Does Dwarf Planet really offer you a lot more than that? Yeah, maybe you get some higher high rolls on the Dwarf Planet, but I think you could get some low rolls than the scale of Onyxia. And at the end of the day, are you putting Dwarf Planet in an aggro deck? At 10 mana? No way you're putting it in an aggro deck. So I don't think you really want to be attacking the opponent's face with this. And I kind of see it as this like control value card, in which case you want it to hit other minions on the opposing side of the board. And Warrior's just got better ways of clearing boards than this, so I just don't see it. The final two cards I wanted to just put on here are the Grand Slam and Tsunami, before the card was nerfed, which is happening today. These cards didn't fill the board with minions, but you got 4 fairly big statted minions that attacked random enemies. So these could go face, they could also go into minions. I think both of these cards, especially Tsunami, are better than the Dwarf Planet. In part because for Tsunami, a 3/6 freezing minion is pretty close to the 4-cost minion that it's like describing in the text. Dwarf Planet is very rarely going to get you a minion that costs 2, which is as good as the cost it should be, because you can't get the battle cry from it effectively. Some of them are death rattles and you will get the full value effectively, the 2-drop, but for the most part, I think you're getting less value than the 2 cost that it says on the card, whereas Tsunami, you're getting that value. Similarly, the 3/5s on the Grand Slam, you're getting the value of the 3/5. You're not going to get any less than that. The 3/5 is somewhere around like a 3.5 mana card, especially back then. That's okay, that's acceptable. You can work with these numbers, but Dwarf Planet is just so... it's so random that it's just too dangerous to ever like put it in your deck and play it. Also, when I was like thinking about this and like other things that I just don't like about the card, if you're a 10 mana card, you have to have a big grandiose effect in my opinion. And Dwarf Planet just doesn't cut the mustard for me. Like, compare this to stuff like Blood Reaver Gul'dan, huge tempo swing, big threat. Reno, in Standard, big tempo swing, huge threat. Puzzle Box of Yogg-Saron back in the old version of Big Spell Mage, huge potential swing, very funny. Sir D, basically an OTK most of the times you played it, but also big swing if you didn't get the OTK, because you're getting a lot of lifesteal. It would allow you to potentially live and maybe just stays up on the board and kills your opponent that way instead. And even ENR now, ENR is a pretty scary card to go into the board. It can be a big swing, gives you a full heal, fills your hand, for example, puts a lot of stats on the board. Dwarf Planet just doesn't do any of these things. I don't think it's going to be consistently killing opponents' minions. It's not going to be doing enough damage to OTK with it. And just having this big wide board of minions is just not frightening. I think the thing that really like gets to the root of the cause of the issue of this card is it's not great in Hearthstone to go super wide. Or if you do go super wide, there are lots of ways to deal with super wide cards. There's a lot of control spells that can do it. Similarly, if you go really, really tall and get a big stat line single minion, there's a lot of spells and minions that can deal with one big guy. There's not a lot of great ways in Hearthstone to deal with like 3 or 4 medium-sized guys. That's kind of more backbreaking than a lot of the other situations. So Dwarf Planet just sits too much into this caricaturist-esque type of play where you put in a big, massive, wide board of beanie minions. But a lot of decks, if this was ever a problem, would just run some means of clearing it up. Like, even Consecration would just probably deal with Dwarf Planet for 3 mana. I spend 10 mana, you counter it with a 3 mana spell. I just don't think it's going to work. Just as a side note, you can Lunar Trailblaze this to reduce it to a 5 cost if you're trying to run Big Spell Warrior. I don't think Big Spell Warrior will be a thing. Also, and maybe this is the thing that they're scared about, is Ham still exists. You can get some of the Druid cards from Pip, and some of the cards from Pip are ramp cards. So maybe the idea of this is that you're meant to ramp into Dwarf Planet to play it earlier than at turn 10. But I just don't think it's a big enough draw to do that. More random cards. We have Jettison. I do actually like the flavor of this card, though. I'll give it that. 2 mana warrior spell. Discover a spell. Spend 2 armor to discover another. This card is hot trash. They should have jettisoned this card out of the set as well. What is the value of discover a spell? Raven Idol is like the classic discover a spell. Or you could actually discover a minion if you really want to, but that is a 1 mana effect. Jettison, at its peak, is discover 2 spells, which is effectively bundling together 2 Raven Idols. Now, normally when you bundle 2 cards together, And even if they equate to that mana cost, you get a benefit for bundling the cards together. For example, playing 1 Jettison, if it was just discovered 2 spells, is better than 2 Raven Idols being played from hand, because you're losing an extra card doing that, rather than just playing Jettison. Now, that is normally true. However, Jettison has this really unfortunate aspect on the card that it isn't just simply a bundle of 2 Raven Idols. You actually have to pay for this, and your payment is you spend 2 armor to get the other Discover. If you don't spend the 2 armor, this card is really, really bad. Discover a spell for 2 mana is terrible. Discover 2 spells for 2 mana isn't actually that much better, because Raven Idol didn't see that much play. Do I think if Jettison said discover 2 spells for 2 mana, do I think that would see play? No, I really don't think it would see any play in Warrior. Just as a comparison, Mage runs occasionally, at least it has in the recent past, Void Scripture, which is kind of like discover 2 spells, but it's actually better, because if you have the mana to play the spell that you discover, you cast the other one for free. You don't have to spend the mana on the other spell, so it's like a mana cheat card with discovering 2 cards in it. And it has no, like, bells and whistles about it, other than the fact you need the mana cost to play the other spell. But yeah, it's just, I don't know, I just think it's really, really weak. Obviously, gaining 2 armor in Warrior is pretty easy, but do you want to push the button for 2 mana? To play Jettison to discover 2 spells? No, that's 4 mana to discover 2 spells, that is hot trash. The only possible deck I can see this thing any play in is the Highlander Warrior deck, because this is the other thing. How many decks in Warrior want spells? A lot of the Warrior decks right now aren't really spell-focused. The only one that is the Excavate package, and maybe that is what you do it with, is the Highlander Excavate package, to try and discover 2 more of the Excavate spells that exist in Warrior, that lets you maybe Excavate slightly faster to get to the reward slightly quicker. But I don't think realistically you actually want to do that. I just think this is a complete waste of a card, to be honest with you. Finally, we have Hostile Invader. 5 mana 3/5 Demon. Battlecry, Spellburst, and Death Rattle deal 2 damage to all other minions. I actually quite like this card, I just don't think it's going to see any play. It's kind of like the weird marriage of Wretched Tutor and Street Sweeper. Fully of Street Sweeper saw like little bits of play. Mainly because I think Street Sweeper was around during the time that Token Druid was extremely strong. And some decks were so desperate for anti-aggro tools that they would pick up the Sweeper to sweep away those tokens. Hostile Invader is effectively Street Sweeper and Wretched Tutor and some other minion where it's like 2 damage to all other minions on the Death Rattle. Which is potentially good if you can get 2 of these effects off, and there's a pretty good chance you're going to get 2 of these effects off. It's 5 mana 3/5 deal 4 damage to all other minions. That's Chaos Nova with an upside, and I don't think Chaos Nova is actually that bad at 5 mana. I think the reason that Chaos Nova sees no play right now is that there is no good controlled Demon Hunter deck, nor has there ever been a good controlled Demon Hunter deck to really abuse the Chaos Nova. I actually think the stats on the card though are okay. With Hostile Invader, you get a 3/5 on top of it. That's pretty nice, honestly. Another really interesting thing about Hostile Invader is the interaction of the Spellburst and the Death Rattle aspect of this card. Because normally you want to kill Spellburst cards very quickly. And this is kind of why I say whenever I see one of these Spellburst cards, you sort of want to play it with the spell on the turn that you play the card, because otherwise you're not guaranteed to get the Spellburst effect. And most likely your opponent will try to kill this minion before you can Spellburst it. Hostile Invader though, if you kill the minion before it Spellbursts, you still get the effect of the Spellburst. You're still going to get that 2 extra damage, so it's pretty horrible for aggro decks in particular to deal with this type of card. So I think this is just like a really good anti-aggro tool. Do I think it's going to see play? I'm not sure. There is a world where if there was some sort of deck that sprouts out of this that's extremely token orientated, that Hostile Invader wouldn't be a bad card to tech into that deck just to deal with those decks, because it would be really, really horrible. If you're playing some sort of token deck, especially a token deck that has like sticky minions, and your opponent plays a Hostile Invader, you're at a really, really bad situation, because you're like, okay, I want to smoke the face. If I smoke the face, they're going to Spellburst, and it's going to clear my board. If I kill the minion, it's going to Death Rattle, it's going to kill my board. You're basically in this situation where you can't win anymore. Which is pretty good if you want to be anti-aggressive. Anyway, that is it for the warrior cards. I'm extremely excited for the Draenei set. Less excited about some of the other random cards we have been shown. Anyway, I think up tomorrow is Death Knight, and I look forward to seeing what they have to offer. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this, why not leave a like and subscribe? Everything helps me out, and I'll see you next time. Bye!